Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me. Welcome to this live webinar brought to you by Barbary SQE Prep in collaboration with CheekyLittleCareers.com. Barbary, as you may already know, is a top provider of postgraduate legal education and has already gained a phenomenal reputation in preparing students for the US bar exams. More recently, Barbary has launched prep courses for aspiring solicitors who are looking to take the brand new solicitors qualifying exam. If you do have any questions regarding Barbary or its prep courses for the SQE, then we will take those at the end. Similarly, I want you to be able to ask me as many questions as you'd like to. So I'm happy to take questions relating to today's topic, which is how to do a skills audit and find a legal job you love as I go along. Anything more general, if we can park until the end, that would be great. The presentation itself will last about 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then we'll have a good 10 minutes or so at the end to deal with any burning questions. So let me tell you a little bit more about myself and Cheeky Little Careers. So I know some of you may have already met me because I do run the Barbary's Careers Clinic, which was launched last week. But prior to this, how did I get here? Well, I studied law at Warwick University and then joined Linklaters as a trainee solicitor before qualifying into their corporate team. At about 3 years PQE, I decided that law wasn't for me longer term, and that's because, frankly, I didn't do a skills audit. Anyway, after I did do the skills audit, I realised that a career in journalism beckoned, and I switched from Linklaters to The Lawyer magazine, where I spent 10 years, 5 of which were spent covering, or running, should I say, Lawyer to Be, which was the Lawyers Careers magazine and website. Having sort of become more and more interested in all things careers related, I fell into recruitment and spent about a year in a legal recruitment agency, having decided that although recruitment itself is quite interesting, I didn't enjoy being in a sort of fast-paced or sort of super competitive salesy environment. So I decided to set up my own consultancy. That has now brought me here, having spent time doing recruitment on my own and some skills training, so on and so forth. As I said, my work for Barbary includes running the Careers Clinic. I'll be running more of these webinars, so do look out for them in the future. With regard to Cheeky Little Careers, that's, I guess, my side hustle, although it's going from strength to strength. It is essentially an online magazine for career-savvy business professionals where you can find inspiring stories, blogs, top tips, tools, and resources to not just to enable you to break into the professions in the first place, but also to flourish once you arrive. Because as far as I'm concerned, and the other people sort of associated with Cheeky Little Careers are concerned, to have a successful career in whatever sector you choose to enter, whether you stick with law or move on to something different longer term, the key, I think, is to make sure you're making proactive and well-considered choices rather than going off and doing things either that are knee-jerk or on a whim. And that's why I sort of came up with this idea of doing a skills audit, because through all the work that I do as a career coach, I come across quite a lot of individuals who feel either perhaps displaced, or they feel that they've gone into a profession having not properly thought it through, and it didn't really deliver on what their impression or their perception was of a particular career type. And they, it's that classic case of round hole, square peg. Similarly, if I ask students, what are you really good at, especially in the context of preparing for interviews, they almost look at me puzzled, thinking, is this a trick question? And of course it isn't. It's a question that you're going to have to, at some point, find some really robust answers to if you are to get through the initial application process and then certainly through the interview process. So that's why doing a skills audit isn't necessarily just about knowing what jobs might work for you going forward. It will I think, help you to ultimately become a stronger candidate. And let me explain why. So first and foremost, as I've already said, that it will help you to identify more precisely exactly what you want to be doing longer term. Obviously, all of you have an interest in pursuing a legal career, but the legal profession is extensive in terms of the areas of law you can specialize in, the types of firms you can practice at, or perhaps you want to work as an in-house lawyer and not in private practice at all. The way I see it is that when I talk to students who are considering their options, there's this natural sort of bias towards big law, partly driven by peer pressure, or it's because those are the firms that have the deepest pockets and do more work on campus promoting their wares. But if you look at training contract options or qualifying work experience options based solely on what the big law firms are up to, then you potentially miss alternative ideas or solutions to your sort of career progression needs. And really, I think looking at it from, okay, what does my typical day really look like, is a far more constructive way of determining whether a particular environment and indeed a particular type of lawyer would suit you. So I think paying closer attention to your own skills and then combining that with what employers are after will make you a much stronger candidate. Because if I were to give you one of the single biggest reasons why students fail to secure qualifying work experience, paralegaling roles, or training contracts, I think it's often to do with the fact that either they're applying to the wrong type of employer, or when they attempt to complete competency-based application forms, they haven't come up with sharp or strong or robust examples of how they can demonstrate a particular skill or competence that an employer is looking for. It's really about memorable stories rather than a list of responsibilities. I think a skills audit would really benefit anyone in the audience who is a career changer or a mature applicant, because you will actually have more skills to bring to the table. So rather than seeing a career change as a potential sort of block for breaking into law, it could actually become your best friend. And again, doing a skills audit will help you to process the various skills that I'm sure you will have developed, but into a more orderly manner so that you can really capitalize on them rather than think, okay, I've got all these skills, but how do they relate to a job in the legal sector? And then, as I said, what really underpins all of this is the fact that the more confident you feel about your own skill set and the more sort of forensic you are with regard to matching your skill set with what employers are looking for, I think you will find a job that you will really like, rather than one that you end up starting because everyone else is doing that, and then you feel a little bit sort of empty when halfway through your training or shortly after you finish your training. So really, in terms of doing a skills audit, it will reveal the following, and I won't go into too much detail because I think these are pretty self-explanatory. Firstly, it will help you to identify what you excel at, okay? I think often, especially for anyone who is perhaps, making applications at the moment and then getting a pushback and not getting interviews, and they then start feeling a little bit negative about their situation, and then you start focusing on what you can't do rather than what you can do. So it really can serve as a way of giving yourself a bit of a confidence boost. It also enables you to identify what you genuinely enjoy doing and feel passionate about. Because for me, that was such a game changer, certainly when I was thinking about career options after I decided to leave law, and more recently when I switched from recruitment to skills training and career coaching, etc. Because I realized that just because I'm good at something doesn't necessarily mean that I enjoy doing it. Similarly, just because you aren't good at something doesn't mean you won't enjoy it. Because as far as I'm concerned, most skills in life can be learnt or taught or self-taught, etc. So for me, where you can marry your skills that you really can run with confidently and that you enjoy doing, then you're going to be onto a good thing as far as I'm concerned. The audit will also help you to identify skills that you have either not even realized you've got, or perhaps ones that you haven't utilized or deployed in recent years, and therefore they might, once you've shaken off the dust a bit, you might think, yeah, actually, I'm not bad at this at all. It will also help you, I think, to identify potential alternative options that you may not have considered. Because if all you do, for example, is obsess over big law or, one particular practice area or a particular type of firm or a particular type of client, then you will potentially be selling yourself short. And there may be other avenues that you could explore that you would otherwise have neglected. And then finally, the most important part of all of this is the actual gap. Okay, so where are these deficits? Where are the skills that will serve you well longer term that perhaps purely as a reason for a lack of opportunity, you've not been able to really sharpen or enhance? Because as far as I'm concerned, nobody's born at being brilliant at everything. Everything requires an opportunity to have a go and then to build on that experience and to then hone in those skills. So by deficits, I don't mean that you can't become good at something. It's more about, okay, so these are the areas that I need to do further work on. What can I be doing to build those areas so that, again, I can become a better match for what law firms are after? So let's go through the step-by-step guide of doing a skills audit. What I've done is a really, really basic version. And you will find out there on the internet or in a bookshop, there are loads of career coaching handbooks that you can buy, which will have their own versions of doing a self-assessment on a skills basis or an audit. Okay. But as far as I'm concerned, a blank sheet of paper or an Excel spreadsheet will do perfectly fine for you. Okay. So the starting point is to make a list of all, and I really do mean all, of your core skills and competencies and even personality traits you could throw into the mix as well. And if you're feeling, if you're suffering from a block, then get input from family, friends, and also former colleagues, other members of your professional network, whether they're informal mentors, etc. Because I find that asking people I trust for their input can be super impactful to get me to think beyond my my own sort of thoughts. And especially, I think that sometimes I do lack my own sort of self-awareness, and something is blindingly obvious to the people around me and not so obvious to myself. So it really is worth your while getting input from other people. Next, you've got your list, and it doesn't have to be, it can be long, and you can also add to it, and it may be worth your while doing it over a few days rather than in one afternoon, and then the next thing to do is to start rating yourself. How good are you at each of these skills that you've identified? From a skill, you could go by 1 to 10, or you could put Excel, really excels, rubbish, etc. So however you choose to score yourself, that's entirely your choice. So the next thing to do is look at the enjoyment factor. So you've now identified skills. You now know what you are really good at and excel at, and you've got stuff that you're perhaps average at, stuff that you need to become better at. And then you now also know which ones you enjoy doing on a day-to-day basis and would really want to see as to feature in your day-to-day responsibilities as a lawyer. The final piece of the sort of audit really is to move any skills that you would rather not be using on a day-to-day basis into a separate column. Okay. And what you're left with, in essence, is this is a bucket list of skills and requirements that I need to find when looking for employers who would be a good fit for me. Okay. And then what you can also do is, as you go through that list, add to it, delete stuff, and move things around a bit, because you will probably find that depending on what mood you're in when you've been doing the audit, your answers might be different the next day, sort of thing. So it's absolutely fine to have a degree of flexibility built into it. And then with regard to the skills that you've scored low on, don't be afraid to include those in the list that you want your new job to feature. The key here is to think about the remedial steps you can take to close that gap, which I will come on to shortly. Now, why is all of this important? I wanted to include this slide because, as far as I'm concerned, if you look at just the big picture aspects of being a lawyer, then the skills audit just won't make sense. I think it's really important to take a far more granular approach to what being a lawyer really involves. Okay, so this is really some teaser for you that I've included based on my personal experiences and based on conversations I've had with lawyers working in all different types of roles, organizations, etc. And the first thing to note is the fact that your day-to-day responsibilities will differ greatly depending on whether you work in the private sector or the public sector. Obviously, the nature of the organization you work in will also impact your day-to-day responsibilities, and that would be obviously the private practice versus in-house. And then your area of expertise. Certain practice areas lend themselves, for example, to more client contact, whilst others have a more of a bias towards sort of black letter law, research, etc., etc. And then others have far less attention to law, and it's more about project management and people skills. And I think that was one of the reasons I was attracted to qualifying into the corporate team at Linklaters, because I certainly didn't see myself as a bookwormy black letter law type individual. The other thing that's worth noting is that it is a desk-based job and it does involve tons of paper. But again, the length of documents and how bespoke those documents are will depend from practice area to practice area. The people skills piece, I think, is really, really important. It's worth noting that law is very much part of the services sector. But again, the amount of people contact you have, and whether that's on the phone, in person, via video conference, whether that involves going to court, or whether that's just contact with clients or other parties involved in a case, will differ depending on whether, again, you are an in-house lawyer or a private practice lawyer. Just to give you an example, if you love the idea of sort of client skills and going off and pitching work to clients, it's worth noting that as an in-house lawyer, you only have that one client. So if you are thinking of gaining your qualifying work experience through in-house paralegaling jobs, for example, that's certainly a factor worth considering. But your relationship building doesn't mean is no longer relevant. It can be just as relevant, because may have just that one client who is your employer, but you'll have lots of relationships within that organization, assuming that it's a big organization that you will need to manage on a day-to-day basis. So people skills and dealing with lots of individuals is, a significant feature of a job in law. Now, as I said, the practice area you end up specializing in will also impact how much time you spend at your desk, whether you get to go to court at all, and whether you get to travel. So, yes, these big international law firms might say you get to travel overseas and you get to go on an international secondment. But if you aren't concerned about doing that, then that's fine. But it might impact the type of law firm you apply to. And then the reason why project management skills, time management, organizational skills are so important is because you will encounter endless deadlines. That said, if you don't like the pressure of being sort of like, inundated with one deadline after another or another, doesn't mean that you're not suited to law. It might mean that you're perhaps better to focus on what I call advisory practice areas, such as tax or regulatory work, which at the moment is really booming because of Brexit and lots of changes that are coming in the banking sector. So let's tie that into, so now we know what the honest version of a lawyer's typical day involves. The next thing to think about, and this goes back to the matching process I've already alluded to several times, is what do law firms or in-house legal departments look for in their paralegals, in their trainee solicitors, or in the candidates who would be potentially applying to them for qualifying work experience? This list, I'm not going to go through in too much detail because they're pretty self-explanatory, but I wanted to sort of highlight them as ones for you to use when comparing your list of skills that you've identified that you're good at and what a law firm or in-house legal department will be looking for in their future recruits. And the key here now is to look for areas where the two overlap. And so, for example, if you've already got some really good scores for teamwork, research, commercial awareness, resilience, then you are almost near ready to start completing application forms. So let's look at the matching process in a bit more detail. As I've highlighted at the beginning, the key to matching is to identify specific, and I really do want to emphasize the word specific, examples of or achievements to highlight each of the skills or competencies listed by employers in their graduate recruitment literature, whether that's their website or brochures, on their application forms or on the people specifications. The latter is more relevant for paralegal jobs, where you'll find that either your recruitment agency or on the employer's careers page, there will be a description of what the job entails and what they require the person applying for the job to have by way of skills. So you've now got your audit, you've got the skills, you've scored yourself. So what you need to do now is create a new column in your Excel spreadsheet where you start gathering information. And you can go as far back as you need to come up with some solid examples. The only caveat being that if you're a recent graduate, then really you should only go back as far as your A-levels. High school, I think, is beginning to feel a little bit dated by way of examples. Primary school, no, way too historic. If you're a career changer or a mature applicant, then you may find that examples drawn from when you were at university are getting a little bit historic. So I would certainly be focusing on experience gained from your most recent roles or your current role. So, and again, if you're working as a paralegal whilst doing your SQE prep at the moment, then anything you can draw from your paralegaling experience and combine that with any university experience would, I think, make for some really strong examples. And I think the more different examples you can have, the better. Because what I've seen is some students will use the same old success story to highlight every single achievement. And think about it from the perspective of the person reviewing your application form. If you can give them 3 stories instead of just 1, that's going to keep their interest levels a lot higher than if you kept repeating the same story. Okay? So you've now got your list of achievements or accomplishments or examples, but you think, okay, so there are a couple of areas where perhaps I need to give more attention to. The next thing is to think about the remedial steps you can take to close that gap right down, okay? So we'll come on to how you're going to do that in a moment. Let's just talk a little bit more about transferable skills first. This is for anyone listening to my webinar who is a career changer or a mature student. For you, what's really important is to identify any overlaps between the experience or accomplishments that you've achieved in previous jobs with what legal employers are looking for. Because most of the skills I've mentioned in my earlier slide, you'll have noticed, do not relate to law per se. They are quite generic skills like people skills, research, time management, communication, etc., etc. So the fact that it doesn't relate to the law, I don't think should be of a particular concern to you. The main point is that you have the upper hand when compared to a student who is fresh out of university, because the stories you come up with that relate to a real life job, I think can sometimes be a lot more impactful on an application form than the classic student-related activities such as organising the law ball or participating in a university debating competition. So related to that, think about whether your examples are unique to you and whether they're going to be memorable. And the ultimate test to use when thinking about which examples you are going to be using is if you deleted your personal details from an application form and your friend could use it instead, it means that potentially the examples you've come up with are a little bit too samey and can be used, and are likely to have been used by lots of other people. That said, please don't agonize over coming up with things that are so unique, because employers get it. They know that there are certain things that students will have tons of exposure to and other opportunities where you won't have had as much experience in. And that's one of the reasons why you may have heard of some employers now gravitating more towards behavioral type application forms and interviews, because they acknowledge that as a sort of undergrad or someone fresh out of university, and also depending on their sort of socioeconomical background, they may not have had the same opportunities as their more privileged sort of middle-class contemporaries. So you may find that someone was able to use an example where they went traveling, but you haven't had the opportunity to do that for financial reasons, or perhaps because you were a carer. So as well as thinking about examples and how you could incorporate those into your answers, it's also worth giving some thought to the behaviors that you would associate with someone who has strong leadership skills or who has impressive communication skills and a really good way with people. And you could use some of that language in your answers as well. So I promised you that I was going to come back to closing the skills gap. Firstly, if you are already working either as a paralegal, as a legal assistant, or volunteering in a law clinic, law clinic, then it's certainly worth your while speaking to your employer or the organisation you're volunteering with to see whether you could potentially extend your remit that will give you exposure to other types of work, or exposure to perhaps a different type of client, which will then enable you to get to work on those attributes and skills that you've not potentially had an opportunity to really deploy in the past. Because as I said, it's not necessarily because you're not good at something that stops you from being good at it. It's often the lack of opportunity to actually practice a skill that holds people back. Okay. The other steps you could also take beyond changing your job spec or your remit within an organisation you're already working for or volunteering with is further study. So I'm not talking full-blown LLMs or PhDs. What I'm referring to here is online courses, summer schools, intensive courses that you can do, over a weekend, or even listening in on webinars. Law firms are brilliant, especially in this pandemic climate, at literally pumping the World Wide Web with quite a significant amount of free content. And I'm not talking about talks on how to do an interview or how to impress at an assessment center. I'm thinking more about commercial awareness and talks they might be doing about trends in the legal sector or trends in a particular practice area, because you'll probably find that one of the deficits you identify is knowledge of the law or commercial awareness. Okay, so participating in law firm events that focus on the work they do rather than how to break into their team is really good background sort of information. The other thing you can also do, granted, it's a little bit more challenging in the current climate due to lockdown, but part-time jobs, internships, I know there are lots of virtual internships going on at the moment, or volunteering. Well, some on the subject of volunteering, again, it's really difficult perhaps to get involved remotely whilst we're in lockdown, but there are plenty of volunteering opportunities that have come about as a result of the pandemic. And again, yes, they don't relate to law in one way whatsoever, but think about it from a skills perspective rather than simply to do with exposure to the legal sector. And whilst we're on the subject of volunteering and charity work, frankly, if you can't find something to volunteer for, create your own opportunity. You could organize your own fundraising event. I recently posted on LinkedIn how my 8-year-old niece did just that. She decided that she's bored in lockdown and that she's going to cook meatballs for her local food bank. So frankly, if my 8-year-old niece can do it, then anyone can. And it can be, something you initiate. And in a way, that's arguably better, because as well as showing that you can organize an event, you can do budgeting, you can also show that you're someone who can think outside the box and has tons of energy, enthusiasm, and a vision. All brilliant buzzwords to include in an application form, but that has legs because you've got an example to highlight it. Away from volunteering and charity work, you've got the classics: sports, hobbies, interests, and entering competitions. Again, opportunities to do sports are obviously very, very limited at the moment, but think about other hobbies. Could you combine a hobby with a charitable event, with a fundraiser? Could you develop a new hobby? Just to give you an idea of what I did recently, because I love organizing things, and I've been shielding for almost a year. I've recently been organizing various virtual events for family and friends. So I had my first ever go at putting together a virtual pantomime, which enabled me to develop my writing skills. It was my first foray into comedy. Obviously not relevant for a job as a lawyer, but that's what I'm after. What I'm after is I want to keep developing my writing skills. And then more recently, in fact, the weekend just gone, I organized a virtual Mardi Gras, and I'd had my first ever go at stand-up comedy. I can't say it was the most successful, but it was, for me, it was about stepping outside of my comfort zone, giving myself permission to try something I've not done before, and most importantly, it was an opportunity for me to present, or frankly, to develop my presentation skills or presenting skills further. And it was a laugh. Well, so again, this is me creating something from a desperate situation that we've all found ourselves in, and having a laugh along the way. So there you go. Hopefully that gives you some inspiration. And as I said, with the examples I've highlighted, none of them relate to law, and they don't have to, because that's part of the breaking that chicken and egg cycle, which I'm going to come on to in a moment, because you may find that the best way to crack that cycle is to start by gaining those key relevant experiences and skills from a non-legal environment and then gradually building to a legal environment. I'll give you another example. So before I'd even confirmed my place at Warwick for my law degree, and before I secured my training contract at Linklaters, what I did, just to give you an idea of how I gradually built my experience. So age 14, I'd already started doing charity work. I did a recycling campaign, collecting recycling cans. I gave myself a Blue Peter badge doing that. I did volunteering at a summer scheme for disabled children that I used to go at. I helped my dad with his restaurant, helping him to design menus. I did a bit of bookkeeping for him. And then that enabled me to gain work experience in a local law firm. So that was actually my first go at legal work experience. Prior to all of that, everything I did had absolutely no link to law. So I did my law-related work experience, which then enabled me to get onto a degree program studying law. And then at university, that was when I first started doing quite a lot of law-related stuff. So was again involved in debating, mooting, but I continued my charitable endeavours and did a fair bit of work doing fundraising again, and I was involved in Rag Week at my old university. I was, of course, involved in the Law Society. I edited the legal magazine that the Law Society used to publish every term. And that was what got me the 2 VAC schemes. So it wasn't something that happened in one fell swoop. It was engineered very, very, very judiciously and slowly. So it wasn't me being greedy thinking, that's it, bang, I'm in. But as you can see, I started non-law and then gradually moved to high street law firms, the CPS, and then bang into the city law firms. So it's worth highlighting that I can tell you now that none of you are the finished products, and you won't be even after you've gained your qualifying work experience or you've gained your training contract, because the beauty of being a lawyer is that it is a process of continuous learning. So you will learn on the job, you will learn once you've qualified, and you will develop new skills. You might park some for the time being, etc., etc. So that's why, as I've already highlighted through how I got my foot in the door, take it step by step. It really is about baby steps rather than one big catapult into the sort of legal profession. I think on Cheeky Little Careers, we had a role model who appeared recently, and she used a fantastic analogy, which is her career in law wasn't perhaps a rocket and more of a Catherine wheel, but the key was she was moving, she was making progress daily, and that's how you should look at it. So be realistic, and it's unlikely that from day dot you will be the finished product and be able to tick off every skill that an employer is looking for. But when doing that matching process, it's really important to make sure that the skills that the employer has prioritized, because you'll see often it says must have and preferred. Okay, so be realistic and be honest with yourself. If you don't meet the must-have requirements, then it may be that you need to revisit roles similar to that once you've gained experience through alternative means. If it's a would prefer them to have, then I think it's worth a punt. Okay. The other key sort of feature of doing the skills audit, as I've already highlighted, is having heightened self-awareness. For me, is really what separates a sort of disorganized, loose cannon type candidate versus one who has that sort of degree of maturity. They've thought about what they're wanting to achieve, and they followed through on a sort of logical and structured basis. And I think if you can identify stuff that you're not as good as quickly as stuff that you're good at, that will really do you a lot of favors going forward, because that's the difference between someone who is arrogant and someone who is confident. Create time to enhance those skills, okay? Because no one is natural at anything. I thought I was a natural public speaker, that I was naturally good with people. And the reason I thought that was because I enjoy it, and I certainly wasn't natural or good at it. Everything I do with regard to presenting webinars, public speaking, talking about networking and relationship building, it's stuff that I've actually taught to myself or gone on courses to become better at, okay? So I've created time. And that also means putting time for self-learning, because if all else fails, at the very basic level, you could develop skills by reading books on subjects like, how to be more assertive, how to become more commercially aware, etc., etc. I spend several hours every week reading non-fiction, reading magazine articles, etc., etc. Okay, and then, as I said, just like with my stand-up comedy, it's really worth your while to step out of your comfort zone, as much as you can, because that's when you really start learning. So let's bring everything back to why we're all here, which is to help you to break into the legal profession, either through a training contract or qualifying work experience. You will be familiar with competency-based application forms, and if you aren't, they will soon become a feature in your daily lives, okay? So how do you answer competency-based questions on application forms, or indeed during an interview? And you may have heard in the past the STAR technique. I personally think that that's a little bit long-winded, and my preferred one is the CAR technique. I've put T in brackets and I'll explain why. So really, it's about breaking your answer down into 3 bullet points. So firstly, think about the context, or in other words, set the scene. What's the background to the challenge or the project that you're about to discuss? Next, remember, talk about the actions that you took. So avoid overly using words like we or our client or our team. What the person reviewing your application form or listening to your interview answer is really, really interested in is your individual and personal contribution to that project or challenge or issue that you are having to wrestle with. And then the R is, of course, the result, the outcome. And that could be as simple as the deadline was met, you exceeded the budget, and as a result, you received, really positive feedback from several different clients, including blob, 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 okay? Now, the T is in brackets because it's worth thinking about that in the context of an example where perhaps it's quite straightforward and simple. So the T, as I've said in the slide, is takeaways or lessons learned from the experience. Because as I said, in certain situations, the example you give might not be as solid, not through anything you've done wrong, but just purely as a result of you not having an opportunity to do the skill or, to use the skill that the application form or the interviewer is asking for. And that's where you could talk about, if I were to do this again, or if I had another opportunity to do this, then this is what I think will be the key sort of features of how I would tackle the issue. So in terms of common mistakes that newbies applying for work make, that I see again and again and again, I've touched upon this a lot already, so I won't go into too much detail, is the sort of fluffy generic answers that, as I said, could be used by all your friends, so therefore not unique or specific enough to you. Again, remember, what I don't want is a list of skills. What I want is stories that highlight achievements. Okay. And then, as I've just touched upon, what the interviewers want to hear is examples of what you are doing as an individual. So use I rather than we. And then the final one is examples that are just a little bit too historic. So I'm sure it was great that you were the, lead prefect at school. It's too old, even for people who are fresh from university. Focus on the really recent stuff that goes back, I would say, no more than 2 years. So we've looked at application forms. Let's look at how you do it on a CV. My biggest pet hate is personal statements, but my bigger pet hate is personal statements that use a bunch of cliches that then make a sweeping statement about how good you are at something. So it's that classic, I'm a really highly motivated, personable law student who has got strong people skills, strong organizational skills, and fantastic attention to detail. And I kind of think, well, so what? Everyone can say that. So as I've highlighted, it's not about listing these skills, because an employer knows that you've probably just nicked it off their website. It's really about the examples that you identify. And this is where, without sounding like a broken record, the skills audit will really make a difference. Okay? So finally, the next point is, if you are a career changer, for example, or your career history is a little bit complex and a bit muddled up, then a skills-based CV would work. So I'm not going to go into details on that, but it's something that you could do a little bit more research into yourself. And then finally, it goes without saying, you need to make sure that any achievements or examples or experiences that you use are linked to the skills that the employer is looking for. What a CV shouldn't include is just a list of day-to-day responsibilities. So think creatively, okay? As I said, avoid comparing yourself to others and forge your own path. Focus on activities that you know you'll really enjoy, and the skills will follow. They really will. So what I don't want you to do is go off and do things just for the sake of doing it because you think it will make a skill develop naturally, by magic. It's got to be a bit more of a gradual process. And as I said, a lack of opportunity is different to a lack of a skill, okay? A lack of a skill can be fixed because it's really about a lack of opportunity. And if you can swap the two around, then you should be able to run. As I said, I was going to mention the chicken and egg scenario. So this is I can't get a training contract or qualifying work experience because then I don't have relevant experience. So that means, firstly, taking it step by step, using the process I explained when I built up to my city vacation schemes. And if you are looking for paralegaling jobs, but you don't have enough paralegaling experience, what you could do perhaps is start by getting a fixed term contract in a slightly less high profile organization, because they tend to be easier to crack. Or it could be that you go for something that has a bit more of an admin focus than a black letter law focus, okay? And it might mean that the first paralegaling job you get doesn't qualify as qualifying work experience, but it's about bridging that gap, okay? Direct applications are always a really clever way to circumvent the official recruitment process and therefore that dreaded job spec that means that your skill set isn't the perfect match. And then, as I said, if in doubt, then create your own opportunities. And, that, as I said, it could be a virtual event, it could be a hobby, or you could set up a side hustle. And that could be blogging, for example, which will help you with your writing skills, or it could be entering a competition that will help you develop your commercial awareness skills. So there you go. I finished bang on time. I said that I'd allow about 10, 15 minutes for questions. So if you do have anything, I've not seen anything pop up, then do send them in my direction now, please. And they can be questions about the presentation, more generally about careers advice, or about the Barbary SQE prep courses. I'm hoping that someone is typing. Aha, there you go. Right, so a question has come in which says, do you feel that certain areas of law require different skills? Really good question and very, very relevant to this presentation. The simple answer is yes, absolutely. Okay, let me give you an example to highlight this. So the way I split the practice areas is like this. I go for advisory, transactional, and contentious. So advisory, as I said earlier, is tax, some stuff to do with employment work, regulatory sort of advice, etc. So it's on a sort of ongoing basis to help your client just manage their day-to-day affairs, okay? And it often means that it's researching complex areas of law and it's less time sensitive. Transactional is banking, mergers, takeovers, private equity, capital markets, okay? Secondly, and then contentious is litigation, arbitration, anything concerning disputes, okay? So where do the skills differ? So for advisory, I would certainly say that it's someone who really is a details person, who enjoys research, who loves having their head buried in legislation, case law, etc., etc., and perhaps wants better work-life balance and doesn't see themselves as having strong organizational or time management skills. Transactional certainly has less law and it's definitely more project management. So for a transactional lawyer, you absolutely need to be good at time management. You'll have plenty of plates spinning in the air, lots of conflicting deadlines, and you will spend more, you'll be doing quite a fair bit of drafting, but again, not sort of technical drafting. It's going to be perhaps memos for clients, some legal documents, but it's a slightly different type of drafting than when you're drafting a contract, for example. So if you look at the language that a company will use in its prospectus when they're going to issue shares to float on the stock exchange, that's going to be significantly different to language used in a bog standard commercial contract, for example. Okay, so those skills are different. Litigation is interesting because, of course, a lot of court work is very deadline focused, but it's probably the one area where you will be able to merge your interest in law with time management and people skills, and also the one area where you'll get to do more public speaking, because if you eventually become a solicitor advocate, then you'll of course get to do some advocacy / public speaking. So hopefully that helps. Right, let's go to the next one.
We're getting quite a few questions, coming in.
I know, I'm seeing, that's why I thought.
Would you want me to read them to you, or would you just...
Yes, please, if you can read them out, that will save me from going through. Go on then, thank you, Jack.
Okay. So we've got another question here. What is your advice for people who want to find an Enqueue solicitor job in the UK without doing a training contract?
That is, I would need more context for that one because I'm not sure what the person's situation is. But if you haven't done a training contract in the UK as things currently stand, and I wonder then, how have you qualified? So if that person can give more detail, I'll come back to that question if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Because there is, it's quite a complicated area. Go on, Janet, next one.
So another question here is, someone said, thank you so much for the presentation. My question is in regard to a side hustle. If this is not legal or in any way related to your chosen career, would you suggest to highlight that?
I think it depends on how serious the side hustle is, because if you include that in an application form, then they might think, hang on a minute, is this person an aspiring entrepreneur or is this person an aspiring lawyer? So it all depends on what the side hustle is, how big it is, and how much time, therefore, you devote to it, and whether or not it's a good example of highlighting one of the skills that the hiring organization is after. So if the side hustle is, I don't know, maybe selling jewelry on Etsy, for example, and it's really just a hobby that pays for itself, then I think that's fantastic, because it shows that you're quite creative, you have, you need a degree of discipline to put the jewelry together, you might need to deal with customers, so on and so forth. You might have launched a social media campaign to promote your work, which again shows that, you're a bit of a go-getter. Social media work shows that you're good with people, again, with communication skills. So think about it on that sort of level, rather than, is this wholly related to law? And if you worry that the employer is going to think that law is your secondary interest, then I would potentially park it and not use it.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question. Well, this person's first given a bit of a background. So they said, I have been working in the legal sector for several years as an in-house counsel specializing in international arbitration, but I have taken a break now while I qualify and improve my foreign language skills. Do you have any advice about re-entering the legal field after some time out?
I think that in a nutshell, I don't want to dodge this question. This is a really complex area in terms of the Enqueue jobs market, or jobs market for newly qualified solicitors. It's always really competitive. And I think for someone who has a non-traditional route into the profession, so that doesn't involve a training contract, certainly as things currently stand, because there aren't any lawyers currently looking to enter the Enqueue jobs market having done the SQE prep course. So we're still at that waiting phase to see what employers are going to do in terms of how they will treat students who have come up through alternative means. It really is going to be quite challenging in the current market, because Enqueue jobs are generally pretty scarce. So the traditional route of ringing a recruiter and saying, here's my CV, can you find me a job, is not going to work. It's going to be more a case of tapping into your network, perhaps approaching the teams that you've worked with in the past and seeing whether they've got openings. And again, another complicating factor is that you have done your experience, you've gained your experience principally in-house, which means that private practice teams would arguably look less favorably, because they would always prioritize candidates who have gained their training in private practice. Because as I highlighted earlier on in the presentation, the job of an in-house lawyer is quite different to that of a private practice lawyer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Callum here says, no questions from me, just a thank you for your time. Callum found the session really interesting and helpful, and is planning to book a one-to-one, so we'll no doubt see you soon.
Thank you, Callum. I look forward to meeting you at the clinic.
Okay. Someone asked, hi there, how would one know which sector is best suited for me?
Okay, so this is the whole purpose of the skills audit, because as I said, that calling it skills audit isn't 100% accurate, because I did mention that you should also think about things that you enjoy doing, okay, and think about what that looks like on a sort of, in terms of an environmental basis. Who are you going to be surrounded by? Where are you going to be? In a big law firm? Are you going to be in a small charity? So as well as thinking about the skills that you enjoy using and skills that you're good at, it's important to consider the environment, okay? And you'll know from speaking to more people who perhaps work in the private sector compared to the public sector, that the emphasis on certain skills is greater in the public sector than in the private sector. So the obvious one being is sort of, again, time management and organizational skills. The pace typically is slower in the public sector. So if that isn't your forte, then you may find that working in the public sector is arguably better for you. But if you love the sort of, the thrust and the high, fast pace of doing projects work with lots of deadlines, demanding clients, because you get a buzz from it, then private sector would be better. But these have to be decisions you make, and they've got to come from within you rather than being overly influenced by what people around you are doing.
Great. Thank you. So with one of the first few questions that we had, where Mohammed actually asked a question on how to find a Enqueue solicitor job without doing a training contract. He just gave more context now. And
go on.
He said, actually, I'm currently preparing for the SQE exam, and I did internships in my home country, France, for 2 years for the qualifying work experience. And I'm looking for an Enqueue solicitor job in the UK. Is it problematic not to have done the training contract in the UK to find a job?
I think that there is going to be a shift away from this compulsory requirement to do a training contract, because that's the whole, rationale behind introducing the SQE exams, the SQE, which is the exam, and the prep course is what some of the students listening to this are doing. And then the eventual abolition of the training contract, which will be replaced with qualifying work experience. I think that at the moment, you wouldn't qualify to apply for Enqueue roles anyway, because you're not an Enqueue yet. Because if you are doing the SQE route, you would need to have finished your exams as well as the qualifying work experience to gain entry into the profession. And also, you would need to ensure that the qualifying work experience, particularly if it's gained overseas, is actually qualifying work experience as defined by the Solicitors Regulation Authority. So that's something you would need to talk to your employers about, because it is possible to use previous experience gained to count as your qualifying work experience, but that would require you to get your previous employers to retrospectively sign that off as qualifying work experience, which would mean getting buy-in from your employer or previous employer. But with regard to Enqueue jobs, it's not the same as applying for a training contract, where some firms would hire 2 years in advance, and therefore, as an SQE student, you could arguably apply for a training contract. With Enqueue jobs, they tend to have an immediate start, so you would need to be on the cusp of being admitted to practice as a solicitor. Hopefully that answers the question. As I said, it's massively complex, and I'm always a bit reticent to go into a deep dive on this topic because, it depends on so many variables, which we won't have time to go into. Any more questions, Janet?
You've got one more here, where Sarah asked, is there anything we should prepare or do before our one-to-ones with you to ensure we make the best use of the time?
Thank you for that, Sarah. The simple answer is no formal preparation needed, but it's certainly worth your while thinking, what do you need to ask me that you can't find the answer for somewhere else? So if you want to have a really detailed conversation about your personal circumstances and to have that relate to a brand new world that we've all entered, which is the SQE prep world, then that's absolutely fine. And I can help you pinpoint what you might need to focus on anyway. That's the point of these appointments, because once you get clarity on what your priorities are, then you'll hopefully go away feeling more confident about what you need to be doing to give yourself the best possible chance of securing the qualified work experience and ultimately an Enqueue job at the end of all of it. We've got one more, so let's take that as the last one, because we've now gone on for over an hour. Thank you, Janet.
No problem. Okay, so the final question, are most solicitor roles target-based on billable hours? Or is there a way to avoid this? Or is this something you will need to accept in your career?
As a solicitor working in private practice, your performance will be based on several factors. Hours billed will be a key factor, because that's what you ultimately exist for, which is to help your employer generate revenue. Okay. The good news is that what counts as billable work has increased. I know, for example, some of the really big city law firms are saying that that could include pro bono work. It could involve work helping the firm to become more diverse, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, you will normally either bill on an hourly rate or in block based on the project, but there will be some kind of target related to how many hours you work per week or per day. What that level is set at will depend very much on the type of law firm you join and the nature of the clients that they advise. In-house lawyers, and this is one of the great attractions of being an in-house lawyer, don't tend to approach your targets that way, because unlike a private practice lawyer where you're generating revenues for your firm, as an in-house lawyer, it's the polar opposite. You're actually a cost to the business. So the pressures will be slightly different because you're having to add value through being resourceful, through being solution focused, rather than just telling your company what the law is, because they'll think, well, you're just stopping us from doing what we need to achieve. So again, the dynamics are different and the pressure points are different, as are the advantages. There you go. That's a very, very simple answer, by the way. I've just seen one question come up from Ria. Should we just take that because I feel a bit mean? Or is that just a thank you? No, okay, let's just take this one. But this really is the final one. Go on, because I feel really mean.
Okay. So Ria said, many thanks for your presentation. I studied 5 years of law in Switzerland, and I'm currently doing my LLM here in the UK. Which Barbary preparation course would you recommend? I thought of doing the course in June and taking the SQE in November, but I don't know if that is a realistic plan or goal. I guess I can answer this one.
Janet, do you want to go for that one since it's a prep course question? Go on, go for
it. You can do the 20-week course. I think Switzerland should be a civil law jurisdiction. We usually recommend for those who do not whose law background, degree background, is not from, if it's not from a common law jurisdiction or your law degree is not from England and Wales, we usually recommend that you take the 40-week course, just to give you more time to just ease into the system of learning about England and Wales, and just to give you that more time to prepare, rather than just rushing into it. So we usually recommend the 40-week course. That's not to say that you can't do the 20-week course. You can, if you feel like that's something that you're capable of doing. So it is up to you, depending on, your personal circumstances, whether you're working full-time or part-time. So it's totally up to you to choose which one you prefer, but we just usually recommend the 40-week course. So if you're looking at taking the November exam, if the 40-week course is something that you don't mind doing, you can still enroll onto our 40-week course. It's starting on the 18th of January, but our enrollment deadline is on the 26th of February, so it's coming up very soon. But you can definitely catch up. Our lectures have been pre-recorded, so everything is there for you in case you just want to, go back and watch over everything that you may have missed. So catching up is definitely possible. And then we have the 20-week course starting in June. The 20-week course will require you to study around 20 hours a week. So again, it's just you looking at your personal circumstances, and deciding whether if that would give you enough time to prepare for the November exams. So it's totally up to you, but we do recommend the 40-week course in your situation.
Thanks for that, Janet. So just a couple of points I wanted to make unrelated to this presentation, but for any current Barbary students listening in. As you know, the clinic appointments, I should have highlighted, are for current Barbary students and not for everyone. The appointments are made through the email address that you were sent a couple of weeks ago. You're, of course, welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn, but for the purposes of making appointments, if you could do that through official channels, that would be extremely helpful. The clinic has unsurprisingly proven to be super popular. So March is looking a bit busy, but we have got availability in April. I'm because, again, due to the popularity of the clinic, we've now got a second advisor on board who is called Jane Drew, who is a very, very experienced graduate recruitment professional with also lots of experience in helping students secure training contracts. The other thing that I'm also working on with Barbary is putting together a toolkit of resources for, again, their current students. And the one that we're putting together first is a frequently asked questions on qualifying work experience, which will, because I noticed just from doing my own research that there is a fair bit of information available out there for what qualifies as qualifying work experience, but quite a lot of it is really theoretical. So what the FAQ that I'm putting together will have is a little bit more practical insight on what qualifying work experience looks like on the ground and how to go about finding it, what doesn't count, what does count, and any other questions that you have coming up. The other thing that you can also do in the event that you can't get an appointment straight away is you can also email questions to us. So if it's something relatively straightforward, then we're happy to send short replies back as well, because that's how the clinic is working at the moment, but we will keep it under review and see what happens with regard to demand for places, and just to make sure that you get the most from the clinic. There you go. So thank you very much for tuning in, everyone, and stay well, stay safe, and have a lovely afternoon. And thank you for your help as well, Janet.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.